All right, so you thought you were getting Grandpa today, but too bad. You're stuck with me one more time. Uh, we talked afterwards. I just figured we'll do this on, and then after that we'll take a break and he'll speak or whoever else. But we left off last time talking about um, just kind of the result of World War I, how that freed the land from the Ottoman control, and it would start bringing back the Jews to the land. So, if you all turn over to Isaiah 43, we're going to consider this passage that talks about the regathering of the Jews from the four corners of the earth. Because if you remember back, the passage is talking about the scattering of the Jews in AD 70 wasn't to just one direction, it was to the four winds of heaven. It was to every corner of the earth. So, Isaiah 43, we're going to read verses 4 through 10. And just as we're reading this, listen for cues, or really descriptors. What state would the Jews be in when they're being regathered? How would they be gathered? So Isaiah 43, verses 4 through 10 says, Since thou wast precious in my sight, thou hast been honorable, and I have loved thee. Therefore will I give men for thee, and people for thy life. Fear not, for I am with thee. I will bring thy seed from the east, and gather thee from the west. I will say to the north, Give up, and to the south, Keep not back. Bring my sons from far, and my daughters from the ends of the earth, even every one that is called by my name. For I have created him for my glory, I have formed him, yea, I have made him. Bring forth the blind people that have eyes, and the deaf that have ears. Let all the nations be gathered together, and let the people be assembled. Who among them can declare this, and show us former things? Let them bring forth their witnesses, that they may be justified, or let them hear and say, It is truth. Ye are my witnesses, saith the Lord, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe me, and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. I, even I, am the Lord, and beside me there is no Savior. So, I think a lot of times we look at this passage, and it's kind of made to be a direct reference to Tarshish, like God's speaking to Tarshish or Britain when it says, bring my sons from far. That's actually not what it's talking about, though. God is speaking to the cardinal direction, so he's speaking to the north, to the south, to the east and west. And he's saying to them, give up my sons, the Jews that had been scattered to them. Speaking to the directions, bring my sons from far. Now, Britain was one tool that the Lord used in this. So he's not speaking to Britain, but this is one way that God would accomplish this regathering of the Jews from the four corners of the earth from which they had, or to which they'd been scattered. In Britain, they were really integral to the initial success of the Zionists, at least. They were a friendly nation to the Zionist cause, and they had originally allowed the Jews to come into Palestine, what was called at the time, but in limited numbers. And Britain actually received a mandate for Palestine as a result of World War I. It was actually given to them in 1922, and it was given by this international body called the League of Nations. Now, there's that picture there. That's the League of Nations when it was given there. And you can see, according to the map, you might remember the Sykes-Picot Agreement, what's Britain and France. As far as boundaries were concerned, that's how the land was divided. The purple, or pink, or I think that's more purple to me, that was going to Britain. The orange went to France, and the yellow up top, that was what was left of Turkey. So the Ottoman Empire is gone. That's Turkey now, and that's Turkey today, actually. But the whole purpose of Britain receiving the mandate for Palestine was, as it says here, is expressed in its preambles and articles, is to promote the establishment of a Jewish national home. Not only did the Balfour Declaration become an integral part of the mandate, but the mandate also reinforced the commitment to build the Jewish national home in Palestine. This is absolutely critical. Because we wonder, why would the League of Nations give Britain the mandate? It's like, well, maybe they would just take the best care of it. And that might be one thing. But this is it right here. The sole purpose Britain received it was to facilitate a Jewish national home in Palestine. In as testament to that, the wording of the Balfour Declaration was adopted into the legal documents for this mandate. So if Britain strayed from that, they're going against the whole purpose of why they actually received the mandate. But I don't know if you noticed this or not, in Isaiah 43, if you look at verse 8, we have a very clear indication as to the state or the moral or religious state of the Jews when they would return. It doesn't say, that they finally recognize their Messiah. He's talking about bringing these people that God has created, obviously Israel. It says, bring forth the blind people that have eyes, and the deaf that have ears. So they have eyes, they have ears, yet they still don't perceive. That's the case for many of the Jews in Christ's day when he first came, and that's the state that they're in when they're regathered. So it's not that the Jews finally recognize Christ and then they're regathered. They're still in a state of ignorance and blindness when they're gathered. And as Romans 11:25 says, this state of blindness will continue for the Jews until the fullness of the Gentiles come in. Just another testament to how specific a prophecy is. It really is incredible. Now, the Jews were incredibly hard workers. They alone are the ones that brought these malarial swamps and these desolate places in the land back to life, whereas the Arabs had just let it fall apart. I mean, it was completely useless. But a big part of the reason why the Arabs hated the Jews is because of their success. Now, the Arabs actually benefited from the Jews' success because now they're bringing crops and things like that, and a lot of the Arabs had jobs because of this. But obviously, for natural reasons, it created resentment. And that was another role of Britain in all of this. Britain actually protected the Jews when they were coming back to the land. And again, had Britain not protected them in the initial stages, they would not have been able to settle in the numbers they did. But really, why did Britain want Palestine? There were some personal reasons, I think, for the rulers at the time with Churchill. These were men, as we'll see in a minute here. They had sentiments from scriptures. They believed in the concept taught in the scriptures that if you bless the Jews, your nation will be blessed. So that was part of it, but more strictly, it was because of just national interests. Whatever benefited Britain, that's what they were going to pursue. And at this time of history, helping the Jews helped Britain. So the first thing here is the Suez Canal. That picture at the top right is actually the canal itself. But it was essentially just a waterway that connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. And it saved Britain from having to sail all the way around Africa. So I forget how many miles it saved them, but I mean, this is resources, time. Obviously, it's not nearly as hazardous because you don't have to sail as much. So Britain really wanted control of the Suez Canal, and particularly since they were a naval power. I mean, that's what Britain was known for, was their navy. Another big thing, especially as we get closer to World War II, was the need for oil. Now, Britain actually thought that the Arabs would be a greater help against Hitler. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. But these black little lines here, these are oil pipelines. They started up there close to Mosul. Now, Britain only has one oil shale, I think that's what it's called, like an oil well, in their actual home territory of Britain. But since they had actually converted their entire naval fleet from coal to oil is essential. I mean, if they don't have oil, their whole navy's gone, and therefore their empire's gone. So that's why Britain wanted Iraq as part of their mandate. If we get Iraq, we get the oil we need, and we can continue running our empire. So that's important here. Now, this is just a little video summary. Hopefully it actually plays the audio this time. But it just kind of summarizes the things we've talked about last time with the end of World War I, what Britain really wanted for this, but very importantly, it shows the roles of the Jews and how they helped Britain get the things they wanted.
The British Army captured the Holy Land in the First World War, driving the Turks from the Middle East. Britain had a vision of a great new imperial domain stretching from India to Egypt. The victorious powers carved new states out of the desert, appointing their rulers. The British wanted Palestine as a military base to protect the vital artery of the empire, the Suez Canal. For this, they needed international approval. The Zionists tipped the balance.
The Zionists were the people who were lobbying all over the world in the Versailles Peace Conference and everywhere else to see that Britain did get this charge, so that there was a contract here. We would help Britain become the ruling power, and Britain would help us to develop the Jewish national home.
So, and there was a kind of a pact there. If Britain wanted to control the Suez Canal, they had to have world support for that. And it was the Zionists who gave them that support. And so in exchange for that, Britain said, yes, we will help you develop a national home in Palestine. So Britain's now in the region. But as we talked about at the very beginning of all these things, in order for Israel to be a nation again, all foreign powers have to be pretty much pushed out of the land. So now there's something that has to push Britain out in order for Israel to be reborn. And interestingly, God would use the same things that brought Britain to control the land to kick them out of the land. So this really, the period from the mid-1920s into the 40s is when things really began to change. The first thing is that these Arab states, which Britain and France oversaw, became independent, just as they were supposed to. Egypt became independent in 1922. Britain was still heavily involved in Egypt at the time, but they didn't have the sole control over it as they did of a colony. As we just saw, actually I don't think I mentioned it yet, but in 1932, Iraq, who had all the oil that Britain needed, became an independent nation. Same was true for Jordan in 1946, and they still had some British influence there. And then India, though not an Arab nation, they gained independence in 1947. Now the Arabs at this time, throughout the world, Britain's empire was just falling apart. They were losing places all over the place. So they looked at the Arabs as kind of the pillars of the empire. And now, since the oil Britain needed was in Arab hands, they needed to please the Arabs to get the oil. But a huge thing here was World War II. Hitler came to power in 1936. And it really started causing Britain to realize, okay, First World War is over with, but there's another one just on the horizon. And as I said earlier, Britain looked at the Arabs, who were so numerous, as probably a great ally against Nazi Germany. So these newly formed Arab nations, now they're independent, Britain wanted to have good relations with them in the event of a Second World War. But now, like I mentioned earlier, that oil is no longer British. It's now in Iraqi hands. And as it says here, this book called A Line in the Sand, it just covers the period from the end of World War I and how these nations were formed. It says, if the British Empire were to remain the dominant maritime power, it was therefore vital to obtain the undisputed control of the greatest amount of petroleum that we can. That was one of the British officials at the time. And that pipeline there that you can see there, it was called the carotid artery of the British Empire. And because of that, Palestine now gained a new strategic importance as the outlet for Iraq's oil. That made the British determined to cling on there amid mounting opposition to their presence, seemingly at almost any cost. Because if you remember, you can see that the pipeline goes right to Haifa. As part of the whole deal with Britain and France, Britain wanted strict control over Haifa specifically, so they had a place to export the oil to Britain. So now that is considered part of Palestine, and Britain needs that, they're not going to give it up. They're going to have to be forced out. I don't know if I skip yet here. We'll just move forward. Another thing, or the third thing, that really kind of led to Britain's demise was the Arab hatred of the Jews, and eventually that also encompassed British themselves. In 1921, this was actually a dispute that started between, I think it was just 2 or 3 Jews and Arabs, but it eventually caused a whole uproar across the, you couldn't call it country at the time. But it was super deadly, and this really is important because as a result of this Jaffa riot, that's where it started. Britain kind of started to reinterpret the Balfour Declaration. That's called the White Paper of 1922, and it's a direct result of these Jaffa riots. So instead of the Balfour Declaration being to Britain's going to help the Jews form a national homeland, now they're starting to translate it a little bit more loosely in favor of the Arabs, just because now the Arabs are becoming more of an issue. Um, but less than a little over a decade later, there's what was called the Arab Revolt. Now this is strictly Arabs revolting against not Jews, or not just Jews, but Britain itself. This took 3 years for Britain to quell, and as a result of that, Britain issued another white paper. This one's a little bit more widely known. It was called the White Paper of 1939, and I'll explain that one in just a second here. But so there was a lot more than just these two things going on in the land. I mean, the whole period is just nothing but killings and murders and revolts and things like that. These are the two big things. To everyone's surprise at the time, or many, there was an election in 1945. So as soon as World War II ended, and instead of the war hero of Britain being elected again, he was actually ousted. It was a landslide vote, and instead of Winston Churchill remaining in power, a man named Clement Attlee was established as the Prime Minister of Britain. And he appointed a man named Ernest Bevin as Foreign Secretary. You'll learn to hiss when you hear Ernest Bevin. He was undoubtedly the greatest enemy of the Zionist cause. But if you look here, so up in top left, that's Lloyd George. He was the Prime Minister during World War I. And you can see on the bottom Arthur Balfour. He was Lloyd George's Foreign Secretary. So that's World War I, and then you have Churchill over during World War II. All of these men, like I said earlier, they possessed sentiments from Scripture. They loved the Jews because of what the Scriptures taught about them. So they were naturally pro-Zionist. And when you read their stance on these things, you can see how God put these specific people in place to further the Zionist cause. But now, after the election in 1945, we have Clement Attlee and his foreign secretary, Ernest Bevin. These guys, as far as I know, really couldn't care less about Scripture, and therefore they were not pro-Zionist at all. These were the biggest anti-Zionists probably in Britain at the time. Now, as far as Attlee's position, it says his leadership of the government covered the years just prior to and after the establishment of the modern state of Israel. It was under his premiership that the late Ernest Bevin, as Secretary of Foreign Affairs, made determined attempts to liquidate the Jewish national home, and he instituted a drive against the Palestinian Jewish Settlements Defense Organization called the Haganah. He arrested leaders of the Jewish Agency and returned Jewish concentration camp survivors to Germany. Attlee not only condoned but actively supported all of these moves. So, I mean, the whole role of the foreign secretary is to take care of foreign policy for the prime minister. Ernest Bevin was the one doing that, and I mean, everything you read here is true. Holocaust survivors tried coming back to the land. Bevin sent them back to their concentration camps. Now, obviously, the Nazis weren't there anymore, but horrible treatment of the Jews. And Attlee is the one who allowed this and supported this position. So really, as a result of all these things, Britain completely changed their tune. Instead of being pro-Jewish to pro-Arab. and they restricted Jewish immigration. So this is a little bit about this white paper of 1939. If there is a clear-cut legal change in Britain's stance, it is this. So instead of as many Jews who need to come to the land coming, the white paper limited it to 75,000 over the course of 5 years. And if you remember, most Jews lived in Europe at the time. Now all their homes were destroyed. Most of their family members had been killed. Um, Actually, I'm sorry, not yet. World War II hasn't happened yet, but there's persecution going on through Poland. They're wanting to escape. So over 5 years, and this isn't 75,000 per year. This is 75,000 over the course of 5 years. Now, any who came illegally, let's say 200 came illegally, they would deduct that from the quota. So there was a very, very strict control over who would come. And after the 5 years, Britain said, we're not going to control Jewish immigration. We're going to let the Arabs do it. And you can imagine how many Jews the Arabs would let into the land. But as another pro-Arab measure, this prohibited Jews from buying land in almost all of what was considered Palestine. It was 95% of the British mandate. Now, this wasn't a design of this white paper, I don't think, but it definitely was a result of it. As World War II progressed and the Holocaust really gained speed, it is this legal document that prevented Jews from escaping the Nazi terror. I put hundreds of thousands up there. I think it's actually more in the millions. Those millions of Jews that would have been able to flee the Germans and come to Palestine, because of this, they were trapped. And Britain knew that, and they still left them there. So, terrible, terrible thing. Obviously, all the Zionists fought this tooth and nail. There were also two events that really changed how the world viewed Britain and signaled that Britain's claim on the land was coming to an end. This boat on the top left is called the Struma. It was originally designed for transporting cattle. It was in terrible shape, but I mean the Jews were using any means possible to get their brothers and sisters to Palestine. So they had close to 800 Jews on this ship. It actually was forced to Ottoman territory, where the Ottomans let it stay there for a while. But Britain pretty much said, you can't stay there, and you can't go to Palestine. So they forced the ship, which actually had holes in it and was sinking in the harbor. They forced the ship to go back out in the middle of the sea, where it sank. And every single person on it, I think, except for one person, was killed. A few years later, in 1947, this ship was called the Exodus. Now, this was filled with Holocaust survivors. These were pregnant women, a lot of elderly people, but they were all Holocaust survivors. I think it came from France, but just like the Struma, the British intercepted this, and it actually, somehow it did reach the land, but Britain quickly boarded it. They used tear gas. They beat all the people on board, and they sent them back to, I think it was Cyprus at the time. I mean, absolutely heart-wrenching, terrible, terrible things. So you can tell Britain is not the Britain it was at the beginning. Now, I want to look at some prophecies about, we read that, the Jews would return, but how? What would be the means God would use to accomplish this? So there's three main passages I want to look at. The first is Jeremiah 16, verses 14 through 18. So if you all turn up there. Jeremiah 16, verses 14 through 18. And again, as we read these, be looking for those things that really describe how God would do this and the purpose of these things. Jeremiah 16, 14 through 18 says, Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that it shall no more be said, The Lord liveth, that brought up the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. But the Lord liveth, that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north, and from all the lands whither he had driven them. And I will bring them again into their land that I gave unto their fathers. Behold, I will send for many fishers, saith the Lord, and they shall fish them. And after will I send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill and out of the holes of the rocks. For mine eyes, where are we going? 18, yeah. For mine eyes are upon all their ways. They are not hid from my face, neither is their iniquity hid from mine eyes. And first I will recompense their iniquity and their sin double, because they have defiled my land. They have filled mine inheritance with the carcasses of their detestable and abominable things. So again, we know that this is referring to bringing them out of the Roman captivity, because it's not just, I'm going to bring them from the east, where they went in Babylon in 586, but this is from the north and from all the lands. And again, only one time in history has the Jews been scattered to all the lands. And again, it's not, I'm going to bring them to Uganda, as Britain suggested, but to the land of their fathers. But now we have how. And it says, first, I will send for fishers, and they shall fish them. Now, fishing, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. You use nets, hooks and things like that. It's a relatively gentle thing. I think this is referring to the efforts of the Zionists. They hadn't brought all the Jews back, obviously, but they were going throughout if we think of the nations as waters, as the scriptures often refer to them, they were going out to these different nations and bringing the Jews back. And that started, in the late 1800s, and it was really gaining pace up to and through World War I. So I think that's referring literally to the efforts of the Zionists bringing the Jews back. Now the hunters, I think a key thing here, it says, it's after the fishers that this happened, and after will I send for many hunters. So first there's the fishing, and then there's the hunting. Have the Jews ever been hunted? I think everybody probably knows where I'm going with this. But there's a reason it's called hunting. And I want to note particularly in verse 18. So this is before he brings them back. First, I will recompense their iniquity and their sin double. So before they get brought back, there's going to be some kind of double recompense for their sins. There's only one thing I can possibly think this correlates to, and that is the Holocaust. It's absolutely terrible to read about, but this fits this with pinpoint precision. And it's worth noting that it is the Holocaust. Of all the things going on, all the persecution of the Jews, it is the Holocaust alone that won world support for the Zionists instead of the Arab cause. If you read books about this, I mean, this is I don't have the book up there. It's called O Jerusalem, but it describes the Jews as they managed to flee from the Nazis in the forest like hunted animals. The Nazis were the hunters. I mean, that was their goal. Literally hunt them like animals in every house, throughout every acre of forest. Hunt the Jews. And as this book again says, it was this that won world opinion overwhelmingly for the Jews. And we can see God's hand in this. Again, it reiterated, the Arab refusal to allow the survivors of Hitler's death camps into Palestine had led to world backing for a Jewish state. So no other nations were taking Jews. The U.S., Britain, nobody else was taking the Jews. And since throughout because of the Holocaust, their homes had been destroyed, they don't obviously want to return to the place where their entire family was massacred. This was literally the only place for them to go. And the Arabs in there said, no, we don't care what happened to you. This is ours. Turned the entire world, or most of the world at least, in favor of the Jews. Let's look at this one as well. Jeremiah 30, so just flip over a couple chapters. So here we have the aspect of, they would be fished, and then they would be hunted. But before they would be brought back, there's a double recompense. I think that is referring literally to the Holocaust, because, never had the Jews suffered in that way. Even in AD 70, the Holocaust was still worse. I think when I actually gave the class, we didn't read all of these. Oh, let's see here. Let's just start in verse 1, and we'll probably end up skipping around. But think about the Holocaust when we read this, because I think there's a lot of descriptors that apply directly to that. So starting at verse 1, Jeremiah 30, the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord God of Israel, saying, Write thee all the words that I have spoken unto thee in a book. For lo, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith the Lord, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. So there was the same thing. Israel and Judah are going to return to their ancient homeland. And these are the words that the Lord spake concerning Israel and concerning Judah. For thus saith the Lord, we have heard a voice of trembling, of fear, and not of peace. Ask ye now, and see whether a man doth travail with child. Wherefore do I see every man with his hand on his loins, as a woman in travail, and all faces are turned into paleness. Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. For it shall come to pass in that day, saith the Lord of hosts, that I will break his yoke from off thy neck, and will burst thy bonds, and strangers shall no more serve themselves of him, but they shall serve the Lord their God, and David their king, whom I will raise up unto them. Therefore fear thou not, O my servant Jacob, saith the Lord, neither be dismayed, O Israel. For lo, I will save thee from afar, and thy seed from the land of their captivity. And Jacob shall return, and shall be in rest, and be quiet, and none shall make him afraid. We'll read this last one here and then skip. For I am with thee, saith the Lord, to save thee. Though I make a full end of all nations, whither I have scattered thee, yet will I not make a full end of thee. But I will correct thee in measure, and will not leave thee altogether unpunished. Now let's skip down to verse 17. For I will restore health to thee, and I will heal thee of thy wounds, saith the Lord, because they called thee an outcast, saying, This is Zion, whom no man seeketh after. Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will bring again the captivity of Jacob's tents, and have mercy on his dwelling places. And the city shall be builded again upon her own heap, and the palace shall remain after the manner thereof. And out of them shall proceed thanksgiving, and the voice of them that make merry. And I will multiply them, and they shall not be few. I will also glorify them, and they shall not be small. Let's see here. Where did I go to? Verse 20. Let's just stop there. But you get the point that, again, they're going to be gathered. But, again, there's this aspect of correction. I will correct you for your sin and your evil. But emphasis on verses 6 and 7. It's asking the question, are men giving birth? Because they seem like they are. Men are in the same kind of pain and anguish that a woman in childbirth is suffering. And then in verse 7 it says, That day is great, none is like it. It's the time of Jacob's trouble, but he will be saved out of it. And I think it says Jacob's trouble instead of Israel's trouble, because, again, this isn't Israel as a nation. This is the Jews of lineage. This is Jacob. It's not a nation. It's Jacob's descendants. I think it speaks more to the fact that, again, Israel wasn't a nation and they were scattered. And it would be upon those that this time of trouble would come. But as a result of that, in verse 8, it says the Lord would break the yoke of the nations off of Israel. So no strangers aren't going to be able to oppress the Jews. They're not going to do whatever they please with them as a result of this trouble. All of these things, I think, have a very direct, correlation to the Holocaust. I mean, the description of the woe that the men suffered as well. I can't think of any other event in Jewish history that correlates to that. Again, AD 70 was terrible, but never have 6 million Jews, 2/3 of their entire population, been eradicated. And it was after this Holocaust that the nation of Israel was reborn and became a refuge for the Jews. So, I mean, it really is incredible. There's always, when you read about these things, I'm going to bring you back, but first I'm going to punish you. But after that, you will be fully delivered. The last thing here, See, I always forget I have slides that help people understand what I'm talking about. Um, Last one here, Daniel 12. And actually, as we were going through the class, we were able to get to an even better understanding of this and a more concrete understanding that, yes, I really believe this is the correct interpretation of that, as we'll see here in a second. But Daniel 12, just verse 1. And it's important to remember just see all the other different things in verses chapter 11, talking about how the Ottomans were driven out in World War I. Daniel 11's chronological, and this keeps with that. It says, and at that time, after the king of the north comes to his end, at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was, since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. A couple different things to note here. This is in relation to the Jews. I think a lot of times some look at this and think it's talking about the saints, the Gentiles and the Jews all in Christ. But if you look back at the beginning of the prophecy in chapter 10, the whole thing is just a discourse by the angel Gabriel. So at the beginning he tells Daniel, I'm come to make you understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days. And so what he does from that point is he starts from Daniel's day, and he shows all the different nations that would oppress the land, oppress the Jews. So I really can't see how back in 10 verse 14 it's talking about the saints. This is natural Israel that he's talking about here. So at the beginning he talks about thy people, and here at the end he talks about thy people being delivered. So I think, again, this is strictly in relation to the Jews. Another thing, that this is all chronological is super important. But the last king of the north came to his end in 1917 with none to help him, just as it says. And if you remove the chapter division, which was put in by the translators, it says, at that time Michael stands up. And after that, there would be a time of trouble unlike any before it, just like Jeremiah 30 said, the time of Jacob's trouble, but he would be saved out of it. Again, I think this is talking about it's the Jews who would be saved out of this trouble. Now, as the class kind of went on, we talked about this one day, and they had some other questions. So at the beginning of each class, we always started talking about just this a little bit. So some of the stuff we mentioned now are just going to be kind of a preview of stuff to come, but I think it'll make sense. The biggest objection I usually hear with this is in relation to the book. And it says, and at that time thy people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found written in the book. And I think when we hear that, first thing we think of is the book of life. Hopefully Madison can still hear. Oh, if you don't see that, it's telling me Zoom's not working. Now, there's a lot of different things on this. Why do I say that this is not the book of life? Well, again, this whole thing is chronological, and if we read into verses 2 and 3 of Daniel 11, it's then that it says, and many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. So, the resurrection doesn't happen until verse 2, so it's after those who are written in the book are delivered. And the glorification and immortalization of the saints takes place in verse 3. So there's a chronological issue, which we'll see in just a second. But simply put, I think when it says the book, it's not a literal book with a hardcover. It's just a way of saying God knows specifically who would be delivered from the Holocaust and all these troubles across the earth, and would reconstitute the reborn Israel. So if you look at Exodus 32, Moses, I think this is where Moses says, blot me out of your book. I think it's talking about a book of people who would enter the land under Joshua. And we'll see that more in a second here. So I want to ask, this is what came up in the class. How many books like books of heaven or books of God do you think the scriptures talk about? I was shocked because I looked into this in the middle of the class, Kentucky. And any thoughts? I don't have a concrete number. I'll have to count these in a second here. But I was thinking like one or two. There's a lot more, actually. If you look at Psalm 56 and Psalm 139, it talks about just a general book of God's knowledge. The numbers of my hairs are written in your book. I mean, it literally says book. It also talks about books, plural, of judgment. And that's in Daniel 7. It says, and the books were opened, and I think that's the verse that mentions it like that. But there's multiple books strictly for judging. There's also a book of remembrance. It says that all the people who spoke often to one another about the truth, a book of remembrance was written and kept in heaven. There's also in Revelation a book that is sealed with 7 seals, so that contains all the things regarding the seals. And uh-oh, can you guys see that? No, I think Zoom's not working. Can you see? Uh-oh. Well, now it's not even letting me doing this. Okay, can you? Yeah, it's not affecting you at least. All right. Now, this is the one I just mentioned in Exodus 32. I'm not saying that this is a specific one because I'm not really sure. But Moses says, when the children of Israel, I think this was after they made the golden calf, says, blot me out of your book instead of them. I think that's just talking about blot me out of your book of people that would come to the land. But then there's the book of life, the one we always think about. There are a lot of passages that talk about this, but every single one of these always has of life after the book. So just because it says the book somewhere doesn't mean it's the book of life. It always tells us when it's talking about the book of life. And there's this one in Daniel 12. This is a book of people who would be delivered from this time of trouble. Again, which book you want to think of that as can kind of be up in the air. But this, we'll look at this up on the next slide, but I encourage you to look this up. This is a book of people who would enter the land after the Babylonian captivity. Ezekiel 13, verse 9. And again, before the class, I didn't know this verse even existed. Let's see, Ezekiel 13, verse 9. Now this is God talking to these false prophets. It says, "In mine hand shall it be upon the prophets that see vanity, and that divine lies. They shall not be in the assembly of my people, neither shall they be written in the writing of the house of Israel. Neither shall they enter into the land of Israel, and ye shall know that I am the Lord God." So here's that verse. The word writing, this word katab, it's something that's written, a writing, record, or a book. So it's really the same kind of word that's used with all these other different books. But, I mean, here it is. These false prophets, they're not going to be in my book of people who would enter the land from the Babylonian captivity. So if there was a book of names of people who would return from Babylon, to me it makes perfect sense that there was also a book of names of people who would return from the Roman captivity. Make of that what you will, but there is a book of people who would return. Now, a couple different ways of looking at this and kind of trying to pinpoint what book this is. If you go back to Daniel 12, we'll just be based out of there probably till the end here. Who is it that's delivered? It says, "At that time thy people shall be delivered." Is this talking about the saints, or is this talking about the Jews? Now, again, I mentioned this. The whole purpose was talking about natural Israel and all the different foreign powers that would rule them. Again, I'm just reiterating this. So if it is talking about the saints in chapter 12, we have to ask the question, why the change? Why is it talking about the Jews at the beginning? And he tells Daniel, I'm going to show you what happens to the Jews in the latter days. But when we finally get to the latter days, it's talking about the saints and not the Jews. I don't have an answer for that. Here's just a comparison of those two verses at the beginning of the prophecy and at the end. Again, to me, it only makes sense if they're talking about the same thing. But what are they delivered from? This is kind of an interesting thing. Now, if it's the saints that are delivered here, and this is the book of life, what are they delivered from? Well, if it's talking about deliverance of the saints from in the book of life, it's talking about deliverance from mortality, from sin and death. But that's not what the passage says. It's pretty clear, I think, that they're going to be delivered from this time of trouble, such as never was. I mean, if you just read the verse, that's the sense that you get. The people who are delivered from this time of trouble, such as never was. Now, if we conclude that this is a Holocaust, I think we have to conclude that it's the Jews, obviously, who were delivered, those who were able to remain alive, and therefore it's those people whose names are written in the book, and they would return to the land, and that's precisely what happened. Now, I think sometimes we look at it like this, that when it says a time of trouble, it's just talking about not necessarily a certain event, but just kind of a general state of chaos across the entire planet. And then we kind of think, well, the saints are going to be delivered from that time of chaos. But we know that it's not just the saints that are going to be delivered from this world trouble, because there's more mortal people that live afterwards. So if we say that this is referring to general state of chaos, the people written in the book can't just be the saints, but everybody who lives after this chaos. So it can't be just the saints if that's the interpretation we're taking. It's got to encompass everybody who lives. Now this kind of sent some shivers down my spine, or shivers. I don't know what a shiver is, but shivers. So it says, Daniel 12, thy people, plural, will be delivered. And the word there is malat, all those written in the book. Now this word delivered, if you look it up, means to escape, to release or rescue, specifically to bring forth young. And this is where we're kind of jumping in time a little bit. But if you look up Isaiah 66, verses 7 and 8, which we'll get in the next class, this is a prophecy about the rebirth of Israel. It says, before she travailed, talking about Zion, before she travailed, she brought forth. Before her pain came, she was delivered of a man-child. So the imagery is very much so of a woman giving birth. It's talking about the literal rebirth of Israel. But the word delivered is the same exact word that's in Daniel. Now, who has heard such a thing? Who hath seen such things? Shall the earth be made forth to bring forth in one day? Or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion travailed, she brought forth her children. Again, plural. So, I mean, my belief is Daniel 12 here is talking about deliverance from the Holocaust and also, the birth of Israel. And that's exactly what Isaiah 66 is talking about. And the fact that it is the same word, delivered, and again, there's a plural deliverance here, people who are saved out of it. I think these are kind of talking about the exact same thing, exact same time. The deliverance comes in the form of the rebirth of Israel. The last thing we'll look at here, and then we'll wrap it up. This is just highlighting the chronology of all this. So in verse 1, Michael stands up after the Ottomans cease. After that, in 1933 to 45, we have the Holocaust. So the chronology makes sense there. Now, if this book is the book of life, obviously we don't know when the saints are going to be delivered. So we have question mark there. And again, if this is the book of life, it's talking about resurrection, judgment, and immortalization. But after that, in verse 2, that's when these people arise out of the dust of the earth. Chronologically, that doesn't make much sense to me. And then there's obviously the glorification of the saints. But if you see it this way, oh, dang it. For some reason I can't go back. Either way, I think if this is talking about the Holocaust and the birth of Israel, the chronology works out great. Tell you what, I got just a couple little videos that sum up the stuff we talk about. I'm just going to play these and then we'll end after that. This was actually made in the 40s, before the Holocaust.
After Lord Allenby conquered the Holy Land in 1917, the Jews were promised a national home in Palestine by Britain's Earl of Balfour. a policy endorsed by Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations, which made Palestine a British mandate. But in 1939, with war in the offing, the oil pipeline from Iraq through Palestine became one of Britain's major strategic worries, along with the Suez Canal, the empire's lifeline to the Far East. To ensure an uninterrupted supply of oil for its planes, tanks, and ships, Britain had to maintain peace at all costs with the predominantly Arab population, which had long been resentful of Jewish immigration. To this end, London issued a white paper which strictly limited the number of Jews admitted into Palestine. In the war years that followed, only a few thousand of Europe's millions of unhappy Jews were able to escape the fascist tyranny and seek refuge in Palestine. By the war's end, hundreds of thousands of survivors, without homes or possessions, faced a future without hope unless some place on earth could be found for them. To Europe's surviving Jews, free access to Palestine, their land of promise, is today more urgently needed than at any time in the long and tragic history of the people of Israel. Convinced that the excuse for keeping Palestine closed had ended with the war, the Jews of America brought strong pressure to bear on Britain.
This conference urges the British government to abrogate the policy set out in the White Paper of 1939 and to open Palestine to unrestricted Jewish immigration and resettlement.
Yeah, I got.
The great issue after the war was whether the gates of Palestine would be opened,
Stop there.
no longer alas to the mass of European Jews, at least to the survivors of the Holocaust, and to our astonishment, and I think to the world's horror, especially to President Truman's horror, the British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin continued to keep that gate closed.
It is my attitude that the American government couldn't stand idly by while the victims of Hitler's madness were not allowed to build new lives. Some way had to be found to take care of those displaced persons, give them a place to live, something to eat, and something to wear. And it was up to us to try to get it done.
Ernest Bevin even rejected President Truman's appeal to allow 100,000 Holocaust survivors to find a home in Palestine. Instead, he urged the Jews to look for their salvation to Central Europe, their former torture chamber and graveyard.
Getting Jewish sufferings under the Nazis, British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin said, "The Jews have waited 2,000 years for a homeland. A little more time shouldn't matter."
That is a pretty raw, ignominious thing to say. When Bevin made that statement to me, and he added to it another statement that if I had not meddled with the thing, they would have had the thing settled. So that didn't help my Missouri good nature one little bit.
The British economy was in a disastrous condition. British policy in the Middle East in 1945 was driven by two imperatives. The first was to protect the supply of oil from Iraq and the small Arab Emirates of the Persian Gulf. The second was to preserve control of the Suez Canal.
So, yeah, you see some pretty terrible things there. There's actually one more. We'll actually start the next class, especially since we're going to have a break for a few weeks or a week or two. That'll serve as a good recap. But as you can see, Truman there, he will have an enormous role playing in the rebirth of Israel moving forward.